In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the structure of the heart and discussing how the heart is built and arranged. So the heart is a hollow organ. It's got chambers or cavities inside. It's muscular, built of, hopefully you said cardiac muscle, and it pumps blood out into the great arteries of the heart. And those are the pulmonary trunk and the right and left pulmonary arteries and the aorta. It's found in the mediastinum, which is that connective tissue mass that's in the center of the thoracic cavity that separates the two pleural cavities from each other. And it's surrounded by the vertebral column, the sternum. It's got the lungs to the right and to the left. And then at the inferior to the heart is the diaphragm. So it's completely surrounded by soft tissues and protected by the vertebral column and the sternum. This is an odd thing, but we refer to the most superior portion of the heart, that would be this region here, as the base of the heart. And I wish I had a good reason, I wish I could tell you why that made sense to somebody, but I can't. So the base of the heart is the superior portion, and the inferior portion down here is referred to as the apex of the heart. That makes a little more sense to me, because if we think about a triangle has three apices or apexes here at each corner. And so where the heart comes down to a point, it makes sense that would be the apex. But again, why this is the base, I cannot explain. The heart is covered, and here's where you got to think back to, all the way back to chapter 1, where we talked about serous membranes. It's covered by serous tissues, and they're referred to as the pericardial membranes or the pericardium. So the outermost layer of the heart is termed the fibrous pericardium. This is not a serous membrane, but it is a layer of very tough, dense, irregular connective tissues. So that means if it's irregular, that means that the protein fibers are going every which way, and that means that it won't rip easily no matter what direction you tug. So we could tug on this axis, and there are protein fibers that are reinforcing and strengthening that fibrous pericardium. We could tug on this axis, it doesn't matter what axis you tug on, it has protein fibers that are resisting ripping of the fibrous pericardium. Now there is a serous layer on the interior of the fibrous pericardium. So if this is, let's see, we've got the heart, and here are all the blood vessels leaving from the top of the heart. And I'm going to really exaggerate it here. So these are the serous layers. So here external is the fibrous pericardium. And the fibrous pericardium is lined with the parietal pericardium. So that's the serous layer that is the interior lining of the fibrous pericardium. Covering the heart, and I've shown it here disattached, but it is actually attached at the surface of the heart. Covering the heart is the visceral pericardium. That's the serous membrane that covers the surface of the heart. And then in between the two, and again greatly exaggerated, is a very relatively thin cavity, small cavity, that is referred to as the pericardial cavity. And it's filled with pericardial fluid, the serous fluid, that the visceral and parietal pericardium secrete. So what is the function? I'll give you a chance to think about that for a second. Okay, hopefully you said that its function is to lubricate the movement of the heart, so that the very slick visceral and parietal pericardium can even more easily slide past each other with the lubrication provided by that pericardial fluid. Okay, so now if we look at the heart wall itself, so this is a chunk of the heart where here's that pericardial cavity we talked about, and this is the interior of a chamber of the heart. So we got blood like flowing in this area here. Well, the outermost layer would be that visceral pericardium. But when we think about it from, the perspective of the wall of the heart, it's referred to as the epicardium. So it's that serous membrane that covers the surface of the heart. The interior is lined with another simple squamous epithelium. Remember, epicardium or visceral pericardium is also a simple squamous epithelium. So the interior of the heart is lined with a simple squamous epithelium that we refer to as endocardium. And as the vessels depart, so that would be what they're showing here in this image as white, that endocardium is, as a blood vessel leaves the heart, it is continuous with, I missed it here. As the blood vessel leaves the heart, the endocardium here is continuous with the endothelium, the simple squamous epithelium that lines the interior of the blood vessels. So endocardium gives rise to the endothelium that is the lining of the blood vessels. And in this layer, we have these specialized cardiac muscle cells that are referred to as Purkinje fibers. And we're going to look in a minute at what the function of, in another lecture, at the function of the Purkinje fibers. But they have very important function in regulating the heartbeat itself. Okay, so then in between the epicardium and the endocardium, then we have the muscle layer of the heart. And again, what kind of muscle tissue is that? Give me a moment. You should have blurted out cardiac muscle. Yay, you did. So this is all cardiac muscle, but of course it has nervous tissue in there. There's connective tissue, and then there are blood vessels and lymphatic vessels as well that penetrate through the cardiac muscle to provide lots of nutrients, and so that there's energy for that cardiac muscle to contract, and then lymphatic vessels that carry away excess fluid. All right, so that's the wall of the heart. So now let's look at the chambers of the heart. And at the base of the heart, there are two chambers that are referred to as atria. And they receive, I actually need to modify this. They receive the blood that's coming back from the systemic circulation. That's the function there of the right atrium. And then the left atrium receives blood coming from the pulmonary circulation. So here we have the right atrium. They're relatively small chambers of the heart, and they have a much thinner layer of muscle up here in the walls of the atrium. And so that should tell you that they don't provide a particularly strong squeeze. They do add to blood pressure, but they don't, they don't provide a really, really strong squeeze like we're going to see coming from the lower chambers of the heart. And they're separated in between, and we can't see it here, but behind the pulmonary trunk there, in this slice, we would see a separation between the two called the interatrial septum. Inter meaning between, atria, of course, about the atria. So interatrial septum. And as they contract, the blood is forced either to the right, through a valve. So there's a valve on each side. On the right, it would be the right atrioventricular valve. On the left, it's the left atrioventricular valve. And down into the ventricles. So a squeeze up here forces blood down into the ventricles. But notice there's no communication between right and left side. these are going to be these are separate circulatory patterns. And each atrium has, as part of its construction, what is called an auricle. This is like auricle is the same term that we have found associated with the external ear. But the auricle is this ear-like sac that if there is blood being moved through the body very forcefully, then it can expand to accept even more blood into the atria, coming from either the lungs or from the heart, from the systemic circulation. Okay, so those are the atria of the heart. Now let's look down toward the apex of the heart, and this is where we find the ventricles. The ventricles receive blood from the atria, and notice that they have a much thicker wall. With our left ventricle, and again we're looking at this in anatomical position from the point of view of the patient. The left ventricle has a even thicker layer of myocardium. And they're separated from each other by a relatively thick, very muscular interventricular septum. So just like we saw with the interatrial septum, inter because it's between, ventricular because it's between the ventricles. And so when we see contraction of the right ventricle and the left ventricle, then blood is forced upward from the left ventricle into the aorta and from the right ventricle here into the pulmonary trunk. So we can't see the valve in this slice. We have to get a slice that's a little bit more to the posterior of this particular slice. But there is an aortic semilunar valve and a pulmonary semilunar valve. Here's the pulmonary semilunar valve that allows blood into the pulmonary trunk or into the aorta. So we send out blood from the right ventricle into the pulmonary circulation because it's headed out toward the lungs. And blood from the left ventricle goes out the aorta into the systemic circulation. And then right here at the aorta, there's also a small opening. It's actually on this side, so here hidden behind the pulmonary trunk, which is the opening into the coronary circulation. All right, how do the valves work? So we got to make a little sense of the valves now. To properly evacuate blood from the ventricles, we have these valves that allow the blood to leave, and so here we see the pulmonary. I think this is the pulmonary. Let's see if I've got that right. Nope. Here's the aortic valve. Here's the pulmonary semilunar valve. These valves allow blood to leave the ventricles, and then they close as the ventricles begin to relax. And these valves allow blood to move from the atria at the top of the heart down into the ventricles in the lower part of the heart. And they will shut as the atria begin to relax and the ventricles begin to pressurize. They will close to prevent any blood from leaving the ventricles and going back into the atria. So here we have the right side of the heart with the tricuspid valve. That's the atrioventricular valve. That's in between the right atrium and the right ventricle. On this side, we have the bicuspid or mitral valve. That's the atrioventricular valve that's in between the left atrium and the left ventricles. Okay, so those are the valves. We're going to look again in a second at some of their construction in the next slide. But a heartbeat occurs then as we see one contraction of the base of the heart followed by a second contraction of the apex of the heart. So we see contract, contract. That's one heartbeat. So now to just finish up the conversation about the valves for a second, there may be another slide where I look at this again. I forget how I put this together now. But the valves are the atrioventricular valves is what I want to talk about. So here is the tricuspid valve. Here's the mitral or bicuspid valve. Notice that there are these strings coming from the valve material. So the valve material is connective tissue. And these strings connect the valve back to these lumps of muscle. They're referred to as the papillary muscle. And as the ventricles are contracting and getting more pressure, these papillary muscles also contract, and blood will be forced in behind the valve and will cause the valve to snap shut. So these two flaps or three flaps, it's actually three here on the right side. Those three flaps will be pushed toward each other by blood pressure behind the valves, and these papillary muscles are going to contract, and that will pull on these strings, preventing the valves from like inverting and and kind of opening back this way, because it would be easy for the pressure if there were no strings here. The strings, by the way, are the chordae tendineae. Here's that spelling. Oops, I just covered it up. It's a weird spelling, but tendon E A E. The chordae tendon. Notice it's an I here versus what you might want to spell. So how you might want to spell it based on the muscular system and the valves. The joints. So it's tendon, and then here's the first E, and then here's the second E sound, the chordae tendineae. And so the chordae tendineae prevent prolapse of the valves. That would be the valve turning inside out and letting blood rush back upward into the atria. Okay, so the right atrium, it receives low oxygen blood from the systemic circulation, and it receives it via the superior vena cava, and down here the inferior vena cava. So two openings into the right atrium. Here's the opening in from the inferior vena cava. Here's the opening from the superior vena cava. And then there's also an opening right here from the coronary sinus. That's the vein. It's on the posterior of the heart. And that's the vein that returns blood from the coronary circulation. And so as the right atrium squeezes, then it pushes blood downward through the right atrioventricular valve, also called the tricuspid valve, because it has three flaps or teeth to it, hence the name tricuspid. So, right atrium receives low oxygen blood from the top of the body, from the bottom of the body, and from the heart itself. And when it contracts, it pushes blood into the right ventricle. So the right ventricle then receives that low oxygen blood. Oh, here's where we talk about the function of the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscle there, bracing each cusp of the tricuspid valve, preventing valve prolapse. So blood comes in, and again, it's still low oxygen blood, is coming in then into the right ventricle. It fills the right ventricle, and then we see the right ventricle begin to contract. And as it contracts, it forces the valves of the tricuspid valve to snap shut, and it forces open, we have the valves here, of the pulmonary trunk. It forces those valve flaps open, and blood is pushed up and out through the pulmonary trunk. Okay, so now the blood goes off to the lungs, it gets reoxygenated, and then it returns to the left atrium this time through the right and left pulmonary veins. So two right pulmonary veins, two left pulmonary veins. The and they both sets of veins feed into the left atrium. And then the left atrium gives a little squeeze, and that pushes blood down through the left atrioventricular valve, sometimes called the mitral valve, or the bicuspid valve. Bicuspid because rather than 3 valves or valve flaps, it's got 2, so there's 2 teeth to it. It's also called the mitral valve because if you looked at it kind of upside down, you'd see the 2 flaps look a little like this, and then the chordae tendineae would be pulling in this direction. So let me draw it over down here again. So here's one flap, and here's the other flap. So to some, with the valve, the opening in between them, to some this looked a little bit like the hat that the Pope and some of the really important cardinals wear. That hat is called a mitre, M-I-T-R-E, and so the mitral valve is the name that's given to it because of that resemblance to a mitre worn by the Pope or a cardinal. Okay, so then the blood is pushed through the mitral valve into, and by the way, if you've heard of mitral valve prolapse, that's the tendency of the mitral valve for these papillary muscles or the chordae tendineae to weaken, allowing one or both of the mitral valves to flop back into the left atrium. So the left atrium will squeeze, that pushes blood through the mitral valve into the left ventricle, and then the left ventricle squeezes. There's another semilunar valve called this time the aortic valve, or sometimes a little more formally the aortic semilunar valve. I'll accept either one of those. And that pushes the blood then, as the ventricle squeeze, pushes the blood up through, again you can't see it, but here's the pulmonary semilunar valve, or the aortic semilunar valve. It pushes open those valve flaps, and the blood pushes up and out through the aorta and through the arteries that exit from the aorta. So that's the left ventricle. So here's a question for you. And this is a human heart, and it's a fresh one. If we do a slice through it, just like we saw, you can see now the walls of the right ventricle. And, it shares this really thick one. But notice the width there, or the amount of muscle that we see in the right ventricle versus the amount of muscle seen in the wall of the left ventricle. Left ventricle is much thicker. So what is the purpose of that? Why would it be important to have a really thick left ventricular wall and a much thinner right ventricular wall? I'm going to give you a couple of moments to think about that. You may want to just pause your video for a second and then start it back up again, and I'll explain. And we'll see what your answer is too. Okay, so give me an answer and pause the video. Okay, so you're back. I'm assuming that means that you have an answer now. Let's take a look. If you said it's because the left ventricle pumps out into the systemic circulation, where we've got to pump all the way down to the toes and all the way up to the tip of the head and way out to the tip of the fingertips, then you would be correct. Because the left ventricle goes to the systemic circulation. It requires lots of pressure to get the blood there. Whereas the right ventricle, where is it pumping to? Think for that a moment. Hopefully you are thinking pulmonary circulation. The lungs are super close to the heart. They're right there at the same level as the heart. Much less pressure is required to get blood from the heart out to the lungs. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to talk about in this lecture then is the blood supply to the heart itself. So blood is supplied to the right and left coronary arteries. So here we see the right coronary artery, left coronary artery, from openings right here at the aortic valve. So this is the aortic semilunar valve right there. And here, they've taken a little section out, but there's the aorta where we pump the blood out. So right after the blood exits from the left ventricle into the aorta, right there at that valve, there are two openings. One that goes to the right coronary artery, the other goes to the left coronary artery. And they're called the coronary arteries because there's kind of a connector that encircles the base of the heart that looks a little like a crown, especially if you turn it upside down. And so from there, the oxygenated blood is sent out, it radiates out through the heart. The oxygenated blood is collected, and it returns to the cardiac veins first, which then merge together to form the coronary sinus, which is on the posterior of the heart. And then the coronary sinus dumps directly into the left atrium. So blockage in either one of these very important coronary arteries can lead to a myocardial tissue death called an infarct. And so that's referred to as a myocardial infarction. So either of these, notice these are large blood vessels, and they each supply a really large portion of the heart. Then if that blockage occurs up close to the openings into those coronary arteries, then it is very, very dangerous to the person. Much milder heart attack would be one in which the blockage occurs out here closer to the capillary networks, where there may be alternative routes for blood to get to that part of the tissue that's being deprived of oxygen. Okay, so that's everything I have to say about the heart itself and its blood supply. So remember, the superior chambers closer to the base are the atria. The inferior chambers of the heart closer to the apex are the ventricles. The right atria receives deoxygenated blood from the systemic circulation and from the coronary circulation, and it sends out blood through the pulmonary trunk and the pulmonary arteries that is deoxygenated, and it sends it out to the lungs to be reoxygenated. So reoxygenated blood returns to the heart through the right and left pulmonary veins into the left atrium, and then the blood is squeezed down to the left ventricles, and as the left ventricles contract, then blood is pushed up and out through the aorta. And then I definitely want you to know all of the structures, all of the valves and blood vessel names that are in between all of that. So aorta then supplies the systemic circulation with oxygenated blood. All right. If you have questions, you know how to reach me either by email or leave me a message on my phone at work.